Season's greetings, everyone. Welcome to Afrometrics news and research-based news to discuss significant events across the African world that occurred in this past week. Everything from Ma Rainey's Black Bottom to the attempted coup in the Central African Republic, police terrorism in London, and black businesses and educational policy, all this week. So several people have probably seen, or many people have probably seen, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. So this past week, this was the film that's available on Netflix with Viola Davis and Chadwick Boseman, who star in the film. It's an adaptation of August Wilson's play, and the movie is called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. And the movie was about a recording session that Ma Rainey and her band did in the 1920s in Chicago. And of course, just before this period, there was the Great Migration that brought a lot of Black people from the South to the North for various reasons, including um, segregation and racial terrorism in the South, to opportunities in the North, escape economic exploitation in the South as well. And this particular film highlights many different things. The thing that stood out to me in particular was the battle that Ma Rainey had to undergo or to participate in or to fight to maintain the authenticity of her work and to fight against white appropriation, and also the conflict between live performance and the demands of recordings, studio recordings or for radio, and for commercial sale that record companies were demanding. So it was very interesting to see. Also, a lot of the themes that the movie dealt with were a lot of the themes that were present in a lot of blues songs. Themes of love, betrayal, struggle, and I would argue spirituality of expression, even though the blues, of course, was known as it was criticized as the devil's music during the time that it was popular. But a great film also explores a lot of Ma Rainey's own gender identity as a Black woman during that time period. However, I think that the movie does a great job of of diving into Black male gender identity as well, because the majority of her band, what the entire band was Black males. So interesting film. Look forward to having a lot of conversations about Ma Rainey's Black Bottom as well. There's also a theme, and I want to be careful about how I explain this, an emerging issue. And really, it's not fair to call it an emerging issue, but several articles were published this past week on the topic of the diaspora and people returning to African homelands, engaging in repatriation, and people seeking citizenship. And the places that this is happening the most is Ghana and Nigeria, but it's happening all across the African continent. So a few things came across my attention in the news this past week. There was an article that was recently published. It was written by Katharina Schrum and it was published in the Journal of Current Anthropology. And I wanted to highlight it because it was about negotiations of diasporic people of African descent for citizenship in Ghana in particular. There's been an uptick in diasporic homegoing to Ghana and demands for citizenship. So what she does is in this article is she speaks about how Black people in the diaspora, particularly African Americans, understand citizenship, diaspora, and identity. And she speaks about different aspects of it. One is citizenship as what she calls citizenship as an effective claim to belonging. Citizenship as belonging. Three, citizenship as a legal status. So people have a sense of belonging in relationship to Ghana. Many African Americans have a sense of belonging in relationship to Ghana. However, a lot of African Americans who are trying to settle there and who want to travel there want citizenship, something more tangible and official. And third is people are also thinking of citizenship through the lens of genetic ancestry, because more people are doing genetic testing than ever before, and that has become a basis of how people are making a connection, drawing a connection between themselves and the African continent. So all three of these things are a part of that research. And Katharina Schramm's paper was based on her 10 years of field work in diasporic homegoing in Ghana. So again, she explores in this well-written article how the sense of belonging of African diasporic people have transcended notions of birth and territory and DNA. So how Black people have defined their connection to the African continent in different and unique ways. In addition to that, there was recently a forum. All Africa Global Media reported on a meeting that took place in Nairobi, Kenya. And this meeting that took place in Nairobi, Kenya was about the developmental agenda of the African continent. However, one of the major topics that came up at this conference was about how African people in the diaspora can have more say, have more influence over the continent's political agenda. Why? Because recent migrants, people who have immigrated from the African continent, who are living in places like North America and Canada and the UK, for example, are responsible for a large amount of remittances, of financial transfers back to the African continent. And so the issue has come up about what kind of influence can they have. However, they also recognize African Americans who are not, of course, not recent immigrants from the African continent. However, they recognize African Americans' contributions financially to the African continent in many ways, even given African Americans' relatively modest economic reach on average in the United States relative to their peers, to their fellow citizens. So this is an issue that's directly tied to Schramm's article, which was also published in an academic journal this past week as well. But it is forcing a conversation about belongingness and identity, which I have to say that the discipline of Pan-African Studies, Africana Studies, is there to explain and actually helps people to develop and negotiate their own identities as they relate to their political struggle in the American context or wherever they may be, and how they relate to Africa, Africa's ancestry, its past, etc. There was quite a bit in the news media this past week about Black businesses. One thing in particular stood out to me, and it was a article that was written in Syndicate Media on Delta Airlines, because Delta Airlines signed on to an initiative that's committed to creating 1 million new Black businesses by 2030. And that initiative is being run by an organization called Operation Hope. But what Delta has done is that it's decided to help the initiative by doubling its spending on Black businesses. So Delta Airlines is planning on using these financial resources to support Black business in several key ways. One, providing mentorship and advice for Black businesses and entrepreneurs by connecting those entrepreneurs and businesses with resources, and also by creating business relationships with those businesses that are appropriate for Delta Airlines. So Delta wants to increase its relationships with Black businesses. Now, this cannot be disconnected from the political struggles that Black people have been engaging in as of late. The calls for racial justice, the post-George Floyd social political environment, and many companies, Amazon, Google, you name it, have been trying to step up their equity portfolios. And I hate to put it that way because it sounds like such a image management campaign. However, there are some tangible things that have come out of it. For example, you may have noticed just last month, it was Governor Newsom, Gavin Newsom in California, who signed on to a bill that said companies and or boards of directors in California had to have a certain number of members of their board or percentage of their board be people of color. Term I don't particularly care for, but people from ethnic groups that are historically underrepresented. So this is another thing that is going to boost the image of Delta. It raises their equity portfolio, it protects them from their brand from any images of inequality. But I mention it because this is something that's a part of a national trend. And it is going to have to force people into a conversation about what this terminology of racial justice and equity actually means. And so, and you'll see that it'll come up in several of the news items that popped up in this past week. Again, we're going to come back to this issue of racial justice and equity and what it actually means. Another issue that has come up, we've heard a lot about police terrorism against Black people in the United States. Still not enough data collected on it. Systematic, institutionalized data collection on police killings in the US context is still not where it needs to be. However, The Independent, it's a news outlet based in London, and it explained that a recent Home Office document showed that police were more than 5 times more likely to use excessive force with Black people in London and in Wales. And specifically, it mentioned the use of handcuffing, ground restraint, batons, tasers, all of these things used more frequently with Black people. So the article suggests that the National Police Council would launch an independent inquiry or review about this disproportionality. What the article doesn't mention that it seems to point to is the international nature of police terrorism when it comes to Black people, and the need to establish coalitions or Pan-African coalitions organizing against police terrorism. So this is important because just this past week, an example of what is being highlighted in its Home Office report in London, if we take it across the, as they say, across the pond and look in Ohio. Just this week in Ohio, there was a case where police officers shot and killed a Black man in Columbus, Ohio. The reason that this gained so much attention is because they had turned off their body cameras. And it's become a major issue of why they turned off their body cameras. And they turned the body cameras back on right after they killed this Black man. So the issue is being investigated by the Bureau of Criminal Investigation right now. But it really speaks to the international nature of police terrorism, anti-Black police terrorism. Regarding disparity in treatment, uh, something else emerged. The CNN Newswire highlighted a recent report that came out about Black service members in the US Air Force compared to their white peers. Black service members in the US Air Force faced disparities in disciplinary action. They were more likely to be disciplined, as well as they were less likely to receive professional opportunities. So this independent review was conducted by the US Air Force Inspector General, who announced that it would follow up in a year's time to identify any progress that's been made. In historical context, however, what we know is that racial disparity in military experience is a long part of American history from the Revolutionary War to the present. Taking this back outside of the African continent, this week there was an item or several things that happened on the African continent, and Russia is related in two particular incidents. And one in particular, the Libyan news disclosed that groups associated with French and Russian military were found to have created hundreds of fake Instagram and Facebook accounts in Libya, and they were fake accounts, but they were targeted toward a particular political slant in Libya. For example, they appeared to criticize Turkey, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Government National Accord, and also UN-sponsored talks in Libya. And this political slant that they were pushing was intended, it was assumed that they were intended to influence political opinion on the African continent. So Facebook closed the accounts once they discovered them. However, also during this week, many of you all who have been paying attention to African news probably noticed the articles that were coming out about an attempted coup in Central African Republic. The coup, however, was prevented, especially prevented from taking the capital city of Bangui in Central African Republic, in part due to the Rwandan troops that were sent. However, Russia also sent 300 troops to Central African Republic to help as well. Back on domestic soil, there are the election results that have come out. Everybody's familiar with this already, but I bring it up because Keneal Pearson wrote an article in the Boston Banner that covered a Center for American Progress forum. And in this forum, there were discussions about the claims of electoral fraud from the Trump administration's lawsuits. And there was a lot of criticism of the Trump administration's effort to cast doubt on the election results. And ultimately, as we know now at this point, that as far as the Electoral College, Biden received 306 votes to Trump's 232. But what this article indicated is that it's important for Black people, of course, to take a nuanced approach to this issue of voter suppression and not react too blanketly in rejecting all claims of voter suppression in this past election just because Trump is alleging voter suppression. Because actually, one of the people who spoke there at this forum was Janae Nelson, who's the Associate Director Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And what she pointed out was that there was widespread anti-Black voter suppression. There were Black people who were being threatened or turned away from polling stations. Black people reported armed armed people who showed up at polling stations and threatened them. And there were black people who wore Black Lives Matter shirts who were turned away in places like Tennessee and Georgia. So what Nelson advocated for in the NAACP was support for the For the People Act, which is a new bill in Congress that's intended to end voter suppression and expand accessibility. While some advocate for making legal changes like the ones that Nelson suggested, what we also know is that there are some Black people who choose not to vote as a political act or as a statement by not participating and legitimizing a corrupt, what they consider to be a corrupt process, a corrupt institution, which is a debate that continues on to this day. At the end of the day, it appears that for Black people, it's more complex than simply rejecting claims of voter suppression. Another very interesting piece came out written by two notable authors, John B. King, who's the president and chief executive of the Educational Trust, as well as Mark Morial, president and CEO of the Urban League. They both wrote a co-authored article in the Milwaukee Courier, and they advocated for a racial justice, racial equity agenda as far as education for Biden and Harris. So here we go again. We see the frequent use of this concept of racial justice and racial equity emerging. In this case, they're writing it for a very specific reason, because with the global pandemic, COVID-19, as far as education, there's been an effect where education has moved online. And because of it, it has irritated some existing tensions, specifically due to the digital divide. And the digital divide, of course, is a reference to the fact that there are differences in people's access to the internet. There are differences in people's access to technology, the technology that's necessary to engage effectively in online education, online teaching and learning. And that was before COVID-19. However, after COVID-19, with education moving online, the people who are most disadvantaged by it are Black and Latinx communities because they're more likely to lack access to high-speed internet and lack access to the technology they need to engage in online schooling. So Morial and King wrote this article advocating that the Biden-Harris cabinet adopt a racial equity lens, that they work to close the digital divide and make college more affordable and engage in more oversight of states at the federal level to prevent some states from abandoning their efforts to establish or achieve racial equity in education. These are the main things that they advocated for in this article. One thing that I thought they didn't mention, that was curious they didn't mention, was the issue of loan forgiveness. Instead, they focused on making higher education more affordable, which is fine. However, because Biden has mentioned in the past that a desire to cancel, to forgive student loans, I found it interesting that the Urban League, especially Urban League, and also King from the Educational Trust, didn't mention the issue of loan forgiveness, particularly because doing that would have a disproportionate impact on Black students, because Black students, compared to their white peers, are less likely to pay back those. They're more likely to default on those loans, more likely to take out those loans. So forgiving those loans would have a major impact on Black households, not just individuals, but Black families. So very interesting. Also, going back to the idea of equity, racial justice and equity. These models often forego discussions of cultural grounding, cultural relevance in education. Find it interesting, they don't mention disciplines like Africana or Pan-African studies, which help students in their higher education experience, evidently, based on empirical research, as well as funding for independent Black schools. So these are the kinds of issues that seem to not be discussed in conversations about racial equity, and some even about racial justice. The issue of culture, independent Black institutions. And of course, it depends on who is using the terms, because some people very much do talk about these things when they, and mean these things when they use terms like racial justice and racial equity. However, the more they're used in the mainstream, the meaning of equity is being, racial equity is becoming ambiguous and a little bit watered down. An important issue that came out as well is the issue of food security. There was a study that came out in academic journals, published in an academic journal this week. It was published in Ecological Economics, and it was particularly on the history of food insecurity in Washington, D.C., and the impact of COVID-19 on racial disparities in food access. So this article, if you want to look at it, it was written by Sabine O'Hara and Etienne Toussaint. So they explained how the pre-COVID, and this is very similar to the conversation we just had about education, because there were these inequities before COVID-19. However, what they explained in this article is that we talk about the pre-COVID digital divide and racial inequity in the digital divide. However, there was also a pre-COVID racial disparity in access, affordability, and availability and quality of food in neighborhoods. COVID-19 has also exacerbated pre-COVID food accessibility. The social isolation of COVID-19 has interrupted food supply lines, and that's increased their vulnerability and decreased their ability to access affordable, quality food. What these authors suggest is a three-prong approach. They suggest the development of land banks and conservation easements so that they can help to preserve vacant land for communities to access food. They also suggest the creation of community land trusts to foster community ownership of urban agricultural spaces. And this is happening in many cities, Boston in particular, where there's an emergence of Black-owned businesses. Some of them are cannabis businesses, some of them are farmers markets. And they advocate for a more cooperative business models in communities. So I wanted to give you all a brief snapshot of the major events of this week in news, and those that are most relevant, those news items that are most relevant across the Black world. So thank you all very much. Season's greetings, and this has been Afrometrics News and Research-Based News Podcast, and you can visit us at afrometrics.org for more. See you all next week.